It's a pleasure to be here. I've had the great good fortune for almost 30 years to be in this world of sustainable business, clean technology, and it's really an extraordinary world, and it's one that even the people who are in it don't fully appreciate or understand. So sort of to level set, I thought I'd ask you to sort of think about wherever you get your news and information, and what if you were to see the following headlines that one of the largest car companies in the world said that they were going to invest $11 billion in electric vehicles over the next 5 or so years. One of the largest restaurant chains in the world said they were going to phase out foam packaging globally by the end of this year. One of the largest computer companies, name brand computer companies, said they were starting to use gold that they had recycled from e-waste in some of their motherboards. One of the largest data companies, software companies here actually in the Valley, well, they're not based here now, had just put together a $100 million fund to invest in ecosystem restoration, or that one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world had committed that they were going to recycle the equivalent of all the bottles and cans that they sold globally within the next decade or so. Or that one of the largest software companies, another software company that is based around here, had just installed the largest black water system in their new iconic headquarters. So just those, 6 headlines. If you were to see those, you'd say, okay, what's going on out there isn't visible to everybody, and it isn't certainly just marketing hype, that this is something really interesting is going on out there. So all of that happened last month. All that happens every month. I've been opening presentations with a slide like this for well over a decade throughout the recession, when good times, bad times, Democratic and Republican administrations, all kinds of cycles. And this has been going on for a long, long time. And over time, we've seen this trajectory where we started off, let's stop the bad stuff, to how do we do well and do good, which is around making some beneficial improvements that also improve the bottom line, to how do we use this to create value, to grow the top line, to where some companies are now, which is how do we actually not just stop negative stuff, but actually create positive impact. So in effect, it's gone from, companies have moved from how do we stop the inadvertently negative impacts that all companies have done as a result of being in business, to deliberately positive impacts. It's a really interesting space. And people say, well, why do they do this? What's the business case? And I've got an old answer and a new answer around that. So the old answer is this: if you've been at all in this space, it's this sort of litany that pretty much every company talks about why they do this stuff around increasing revenue and decreasing costs and innovation and improving quality, the ability to attract and retain talent like you guys, the next generation of leaders, being a preferred supplier if you're part of a supply chain, and then of course the brand and reputational stuff, which I always put last because most people out there assume that that's the number one. That's the first thing, that why companies do what they do, to improve their image. And in fact, actually, it's quite the opposite, that companies are actually doing much more than they're talking about. They're actually walking way more than they're talking. We can talk about that later if you want. So that's my old answer, and it's not untrue, but really the business case these days for this really boils down to one word. This is about risk. And there's all kinds of risk in business. There's financial risk, and there's the brand reputational stuff, and there's policy, the risk that policies might change, or that you may not have a supply chain continuity if you're in certain industries, stranded assets, and simply the right to operate, the social license to operate. If you're a significant water user in a water-stressed area, of which there are many, you may not be welcome. Even though you may be far more efficient than pretty much everyone else in the area, they just may not be welcome. So this is what risk is all about in businesses. And if you look at these companies on the screen, this is a bunch of companies that all have one thing in common. And if you look at these are companies across a whole range of sectors, from probably 5 continents, companies you've heard of, companies you haven't, from life's necessities like cement and chemicals and beer to a whole range of things. And what do they all have in common? They all had to restate their earnings because of supply chain constraints in their key commodities, right? And it's not, and so this is where sustainability now lies a lot, is how do they ensure a lot of this risk? And so you look at what some companies are doing. Unilever, a number of years ago, created this sustainable living plan where they're really supporting their supply chains and of where they source their material, and they're helping improve the lives and the livelihoods of a billion people that they want to be their next billion customers. They're obviously not coming from here. They're coming from places that are just now knocking on the door of the middle class, and improving the standard of living again for their smallholders and at the very end of their supply chains. You look at Dow and investing in ecosystems, understanding the economic value of the ecosystems that support them and all business. This is ecosystems are the things like the hydrologic cycle, or the pesticide control, or the erosion control, or all of the different things that nature provides for free but don't end up on the balance sheet. They're realizing that they actually do have value, and if you start to measure the economic value, you can make some decisions around that in terms of how you site, or whether you site, or what kind of wastewater treatment plant you might have near a factory. Can you actually repair the stream to do what nature does naturally, as opposed to building a steel and concrete kind of facility, and does that pencil out, and is that as or more effective? And they're finding that in some cases it is, but you don't know that until you can actually put a value on this. Or these guys, Tiffany, that's looking at how they source fiber and everything from their for their bags and boxes, and which is obviously for them iconic. And of course, how they keep illicit or unethical products out of their supply chain, and the technologies, now blockchain and all kinds of things they're using for that. So you look at these kinds of things, they're not green, they're not marketing this stuff. This is really about risk. And so that's the world that I find fascinating here. And that companies need to be looking at risk, and not doing so is a risk factor. So it's not the business case of why do this, it's what's the risk of not doing these things, of not paying attention to sustainability and climate and all the impacts on their supply chain. So my company, GreenBiz Group, among many things that we do, is we put out an annual State of Green Business report. It's a free download from greenbiz.com if you want to check it out. And we work with a company called TrueCost out of the UK. They're now actually part of S&P Global. Then they measure the natural capital impacts of about 700 impacts from about 2,000 companies, 600 or 700 different environmental impacts, which is to say that natural capital impacts are things that companies take out of the ecosphere, biosphere, and things that they emit back into the air, water, and soil. And putting a price on that, what's the price of a gallon or a million gallons of water? What's the price of carbon? What's the price of trees? All these different things. They've actually been able to quantify that. And we do a number of metrics, and it's in the report every year, looking back for the past 5 years to see how companies are doing. And and as well as a number of other trends that look at how companies are thinking about this stuff. And you see some great progress, and more companies are setting targets. Although it's still only a small fraction of what companies need to be doing to address the Paris goals, more stock exchanges now around the world are starting to either require or encourage their listed companies to adhere to a number of environmental criteria. Representing 40,000 companies. Greenhouse gas emissions are falling a little bit, not lowest level for the last 5 years, but still not at the scale, scope, and speed that's needed. More companies are disclosing what they're doing in terms of their carbon emissions. The natural capital cost, as I was saying before, this actually putting a price tag of all the impacts that companies make of this index of 1,200 global companies exceeded $4 trillion for the first time, which represents twice their income. So let me explain what that is. It's a little, what they do is if you look at all of the impacts and add that up into dollars, and you look at the profits that those companies had, the impacts are, in some cases, they certainly wipe out there more than 100% of the profits, in some cases more than 200%. Now, the companies don't pay these prices. This is theoretical, but these are risks as carbon prices, as other constraints. These represent inefficiencies in terms of or represent risk that companies have in terms of the impacts on the planet. And so as companies start to pay attention to this and measure and benchmark, they're finding, identifying where there are opportunities to reduce those risks, and usually in the process reducing costs and things. So the point of all this is that there's a lot going on out there. It's really never gets old after quite a long time in this space, but it's not really moving fast enough. There's still not enough progress. It's still incremental in a lot of ways. And yet, as it says, I'm still optimistic about this. I want to talk about some of the things I'm excited about and that I think give a lot of hope for where this is all going. Three things I'm going to talk about. The first is the circular economy. Does that term resonate? Do people sort of know, have talked about that a little bit? Great. Okay, good. It's more than most audiences that half of you know what that is. And of course, that's as compared to the linear economy as we sort of take, make, and waste things over time. And how do we do this? And it's not just about closing the loop. This is not about recycling 2.0. This is about a whole range of things. And the four-word definition I have is just how do we, keeping molecules in play. How do we keep molecules of all kinds, including water and other, everything that we use to manufacture and produce everything we have, how do we keep those in play continuously? And it involves a lot of different things. It involves, how do we create the supplies, the inputs, bio-based renewable inputs. How do we extend the life of things so they stay in service for a lot longer? How do we maximize the utilization of things? The sharing economy obviously is a good part of that. How do we turn products into services where the product is not the it's really about the experience or the use of the product rather than the product itself. And of course, how do we recover everything and put it back into production or put it safely back into the air, water, and soil? And there's companies associated with all of these things. There's quite a lot going on, and I'm happy to in Q&A to talk about any of the specifics here, but I want to get through sort of a lot of what's going on. What this involves really is pretty much every part. And this is one of the things I'm really fascinated with about the circular economy is that this is the first framework I've seen in almost 30 years that requires companies to really look at and engage the entire value chain of what they do, from how they design things and what they're made of, all the way to the relationship with customers. Give you a quick example. There's a furniture company that makes office furniture, and they're now looking at circular economy as a bigger opportunity than their traditional model. Because if you buy office furniture, if you have this building as a customer, forget it's a school, pretend it's a business. This business is going to grow, shrink, move, reorganize, merge, acquire, divest, change culture, just grow old, grow tired of what's around. And if I own this business and I bought this furniture, I've got to deal with all this stuff, and then I got to get new stuff. But why not, have a subscription model where I'm going to provide you the furniture you need, and I'll change it and keep it new and fresh and up to date, and replace things if it's broken, and take it away if you don't need it anymore, and all of that. If that's the arrangement, then now I have to think about, first of all, what's it made of? And how do I make it in a way that I can use those same resources over and over? How do I manufacture it? What's the relationship? I'm now, instead of having a one-time sale and maybe a 3 or 5 year service contract, I might have a 10 or even 20 year relationship with this customer. And how do I think about getting this stuff back disassembling it to its constituent parts, putting it back into production, because these things are now assets that I want to maximize. That's a fundamental shift in how this company works. And as I said, they see that opportunity to be as big as the multi-billion-dollar sales that they now have. And we see that across a lot of companies now, across a lot of sectors. There's a Circular Economy 100, and I just think it's really interesting because it mandates systems thinking and new kinds of value chains and business model innovation, not just in the products themselves. And it has the potential to be regenerative and restorative, and promotes resilience. And if you're recycling this stuff or keeping molecules in play, odds are that you want to do that locally and within regional networks, as opposed to, we now ship stuff, or we had been shipping stuff to China to be recycled. China doesn't want it anymore. They've stopped accepting most of the trash and recyclables and e-waste and things we used to send them. And so that's a fundamental shift. And so there's a lot of local resilience. If we can keep those molecules in play locally, there's a lot of potential. So I'm fascinated with the circular economy. Also, the convergence of technologies, and there's a whole raft of technologies, and of course we're here in the middle of where this stuff is coming from. But obviously, everything from resilience and the connected vehicles and intelligent buildings and food systems and machine learning and AI and on, blockchain, as I said before, the Internet of Things and energy storage, and you start to look at all of these things. And the advanced materials and 3D printing, that the new part of the new manufacturing economy. And you say, okay, those are all really interesting tools. Those are all, when you start to apply them or put them through a sustainability filter. But what gets really exciting is what happens when they all come together. And you start to pull apart 2 or 3 or 4 of those, and you see what the opportunities are and how those start to play out. And that's very exciting. We do a conference every year. It's going to be actually in Oakland in October, called Verge, which is around this, how the convergence of technologies accelerates sustainability solutions in a climate and resource constrained world. And when you see some of the things that come out of this, it's about electrifying automobiles, even airplanes now, and heating and cooling. And so how do you electrify everything and get that electricity from renewable sources? Obviously, the whole world of autonomous, electric, connected, shared vehicles is pretty much where things are going. I talked to my friends at GM, and I said, did you have any idea 2 years ago where you would be in terms of thinking about this? And they said 2 years ago, about 1 year ago. This is moving so quickly, the transformation in the auto industry, that it's moving much faster than production cycles in automotive manufacturing move. How we move people around and what mobility, move people and things around. This is going to revolutionize a lot of that. We're getting to the point in a lot of cities where we're reaching peak delivery, right? You've got, the same day and next day this, and Uber Eats and all these delivery services. And at some point, we're going to max out on the available space, and not to mention air quality for a lot of these things. So how do we solve around that? And how do these technologies get deployed? How do we develop microgrids that provide resilience to the grid? During the hurricane, was it the one that went through Puerto Rico? That was Maria. Cuba actually didn't get hit they got hit hard, but they did not suffer the way Puerto Rico did, and it's because they have a lot of microgrids that they had built over time, and so they were able to get back online much faster. Healthy and adaptive buildings, the blockchain and the traceability of supply chains, where you're able to look at much more efficiently and effectively look at the chain of custody from forestry and minerals and pretty much everything that gets traded in the far reaches of supply chains that can have a sustainability impact if done the wrong way. Revolutionizing how manufacturing is done and how it can be done locally, and I'm sure you're all over additive manufacturing and how that's second nature, becoming second nature to a generation that will, like the internet was to my generation, that not only changes how you do things, but how you think about what's possible to do. And then food and water systems, the ability to grow things locally at scale and to provide the, the indoor ag revolution, the rooftop and vertical ag, and of course even particularly in the fields of the ability to do precision ag and deliver what we need with far fewer inputs and impacts. So this is a really exciting area. And again, this is what sustainability really should be about, which is, again, systems thinking. It's about radical efficiency, asking big questions and breaking down barriers, and ultimately about improving lives and moving the needle on some of the big social and environmental impacts. So that's number two. And the last one I want to talk about comes out of this bastion of liberal progressive thinking. A number of years ago, 2009, a Marine colonel and a Navy captain were commissioned by Mike Mullen, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military in the national government, to look at a grand strategy for America. And I know that sounds crazy. What's that grand strategy? I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But they came out, they were holed up in the Pentagon for a few months, and they came out with this document that said that sustainability must be the organizing logic for a new strategic national imperative. That's like, really, what is that about? And I met the Marine colonel over time, but learned the story and ended up, as you'll see, working with him. But a part of it is how they define sustainability. Sustainability, they say, is an organism's ability to remain diverse and productive over time. And if you take those two words, diversity is about security. It's about strength and redundancy and resilience, the ability to bounce back quickly from shocks of any kind. And productivity is about growth and prosperity. And they said, well, security and prosperity are America's two enduring values, if you look at the history of the country. So they looked at the Marine colonel retired from the Marines and connected with the only guy thinking about grand strategy in Washington, a guy called Patrick Doherty. Mark Puck Mickleby is the Marine. And then connected with me, looking at it from the business angle. We produced this book a couple of years ago. Sort of a grand strategy for America, born at the Pentagon, that puts sustainability, prosperity, and security on a level playing field. So I want to talk a little bit about this. First of all, grand strategy is a thing that we have done. It's a uniquely American way of addressing big challenges that we have taken on at critical moments in our history to tackle the sort of existential moments of the day by aligning our economy with the governing institutions and foreign policy. So just for example, in World War II, the run-up to World War II, when America's factories were pretty idle because we were coming out of a depression, and FDR basically harnessed the private sector, brought the president of General Motors into the federal government and had him sort of create this system for producing things that ended up being part of the war effort. And by the end of the war, America was producing 40–50% of what all the Allied forces were using, and really bringing our factories to life in a way that they hadn't been before. And we were known as the arsenal for democracy. That was a term coined in the State Department that we were going to be. And so the war ended, and the new problem was the Soviet threat, communism, and we had just come out of a war, and we knew that we didn't want to take on the Russians on the Soviet Union in the battlefield. So the strategy was containment. Is how do we contain them on the battle not in the battlefield, but in the global chessboard, while outcompeting them economically? And so that led to the to bringing people back from 15 million GIs back and putting them to work. It meant building out the interstate highway and defense system, which it was originally called. It meant dispersing the population along that interstate system to keep them in some ways out of the big cities, which became the suburbs and suburban sprawl. It meant feeding not just Americans, but the world, because Europe and Japan in particular we destroyed their agricultural system, and so we wanted to be the ones feeding them as opposed to the Soviet Union. And so, and a whole system that came out of this, it was very strategic from an American foreign policy perspective, but also built this incredible economy that took us for the next 50 years, building out everything that, both the boom and everything that ended up being an environmental challenge, suburban sprawl and air pollution and monoculture agriculture and a whole bunch of other things. But it worked from the perspective of containing communism. And Christmas Day, what was it, 1991, when they lowered the hammer and sickle in the Kremlin for the last time, it was sort of, yeah, all right, check. But then the question is, well, what is the great global challenge now? Because we've been operating sort of out of that same playbook for the past 20 or so years, or more 30 or 40 years, and we haven't really had a new one. So we looked at grand strategy and looked at this idea of sustainability as a driving force and said, well, there's the existential threat is global unsustainability, which is made up of 4 components. One is the rapid economic inclusion of 3 billion people into the middle class, and how do we do that without busting the natural capital budget, let alone and just polluting ourselves out of existence? How do we deal with ecological depletion in general, just the fact the resources that we have, including the resources of clean air and climate, but how do we just deal with that in part of this? There's the resilience deficit, which is the very brittle supply chains and infrastructure that exist all over the world. And at the same time, there's the fact that so many of the economies have really been kept propped up by monetary policy, by putting money into the market, and not necessarily by natural growth. We're just coming out of that now in the United States, but still most nations are propped up by central planning. So if you look at those things and put them all together and realize that you can't really solve any one of these without addressing them all, that sort of became the plan. And there's a formula for grand strategy, which is that as there was in the Arsenal democracy and containment, and now this new world, which is that if you start with the demand, with the private sector, and stand on the economy, and you back out the stranded assets, back in the day it was 15 million GIs coming back from the war with no jobs, and a lot of women who had been in the factories who now had no jobs, and how do you put them to work? That you find the capital to do this, which is no small thing, that you create this new economic engine. So we created this plan for how to do this. And we said, and I just want to focus on the pools of demand, that there are 3 big, massive pools of demand. This came out of, really based on this work that was done at the Pentagon, for walkable communities, regenerative agriculture, and resource productivity. So walkable communities, I mean, most people, when you survey them, want some aspects of a smart growth community. They want walkable, they want within half-mile lifestyle of shopping and entertainment and transit. They want green space, they want their kids to be able to play. And most of the investment in real estate is not going into that direction. So that's a big mismatch. We also have this phenomenon where my generation, the boomers, are now moving back into cities, want to be where the action is, and we're afraid we're going to get stuck in the suburb, and the kids are going to take away the car keys. And as are the millennials, and now there's this massive demand for housing in cities. And so much of the policy and the subsidies and the ordinances still incentivize sprawl. They still incentivize the car-based culture, and a lot of the just simply how wide a street has to be a street has to be for a fire engine to be able to go down, emergency vehicle. That takes away from the meandering smaller streets that mark a lot of smaller communities. So there's just a lot of of laws that we've baked into this. But it's a massive opportunity. We estimated that over, almost $250 billion worth of new opportunity in home sales, plus a lot more in just avoided public expenditures for infrastructure, particularly for building out the next suburban sprawl. Agriculture, we've got to grow a lot of food, and it all has to be done regeneratively, which means agriculture that rebuilds soils, that cleans waterways and sequesters carbon, which is kind of the opposite of how at least most industrial agriculture is currently done. And again, the policies we have incentivize the monocrops, the large, what was in the Nixon administration called fence post to fence post farming. And again, it's another big, massive opportunity in terms of additional revenue to farmers. And then finally, the resource revolution, which is something that's been ongoing, which is how do we bring the middle class, people into the middle class with the resources that we have available? Obviously, the circular economy is one key part of that, but it's also the distributed and the bio-based and the renewable and all those different parts of the economy. And it's the biggest opportunity of all, almost $1 trillion a year of additional revenue potential by capturing the waste and producing things in this. There's advanced materials and new kinds of products and services. So I'm going through this really kind of quickly. We can talk more about this, but if you put it all together, we've got about $1.25 trillion or so annual opportunity, and addressing a lot of things that are very much part of the sustainability agenda: decarbonizing, detoxifying, dematerializing the economy, creating jobs, creating economic development, upward mobility, economic mobility, social cohesion, public health improvements, food, energy, water, housing security. It's a really, I really think it's an interesting story and an interesting way. And again, this is what I think is so exciting here, is this is a business-led opportunity. This is not about government policy, although government could help. This is about pushing markets faster towards sustainability. As I said before, it's about local and ultimately national resilience. Internationally, it's around reducing resource tensions, building citizen participation and trust in government. Wouldn't that be different? And it really is, in some ways, the best of a progressive agenda with a conservative approach, which is by business, for profit, and Washington can lead, follow, or get out of the way. But most of all, what I think is exciting about this, and I'll end on, is that this vision of this grand strategy for me, and what was attractive to me, is this addresses a question that I've been asking for a long, long time, which is that we don't really have an answer to, which is, what's the story we get to tell if we get things right? We know what the story is if we get things wrong. Thank you, Al Gore. Thank you, Bill McKibben. Thank you, Rachel Carson. I mean, thank you. Right? But we don't have that positive story around sustainability, that's happy path of all that's possible if we can line these things up and start to head down this path. And I think that's the story we haven't figured out how to tell. So, I'll stop there. We put it all together and we see that companies are starting to move in this new direction and looking at risk in a different way and thinking about their natural capital impacts and how to reduce those, and these opportunities around the circular economy and the role of technology, and even looking at this from a grand strategic level. This is a really incredibly exciting time to be looking at sustainability and the economy and business. Thanks. So, got, 15 minutes or so for some questions. I talked a little longer than I should have, but yeah, let's start right there.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That was a great talk. I want to ask about consumers and what role do they play in terms of driving these changes that businesses are making. What are really the biggest levers that are causing businesses to change? Is it really this realization that we can, there's so much risk out there, or what is there a different behavior change or trend in society that's driving that?
Yeah, the question is what's the role of consumers in all this, and how do we what's the role they play in mobilizing companies? And it's a great question. You're not going to like the answer, my answer at least. I mean, I got into this because I was drafted to create, I was a business and consumer writer, and I was drafted by Penguin Books to create the US edition of a British bestseller called The Green Consumer Guide. So in 1989, I did this. It came out in the run-up to Earth Day 1990, and I was instantly anointed an expert on green consumer issues, and very quickly had a weekly syndicated column in 90 newspapers, and spent a bunch of years crisscrossing the country and beyond, preaching the gospel that every time you open your wallet, you cast a vote for or against the environment, and the marketplace isn't a democracy. It doesn't take 51%, blah, 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 blah. Until I looked over my shoulder and I realized I was kind of standing there by myself, that there was no green consumer movement in the United States. But the companies I was being asked to come in and talk to about that themselves were addressing a lot of things, and that's sort of set me down this path around sustainable business. In 1989, when I was writing this book, the first ever survey of consumers and environmental purchasing came out by a now defunct organization called the Michael Peters Group, and it said that 89% of consumers would gladly make the green choice if they had one, and 74, I think, percent would even pay a premium for the privilege of doing that, 5% or something. And over the past, so 1989, so almost 30 years, those numbers haven't changed much, but neither have consumer shopping carts or habits. And so there's been this big disconnect, and it turns out it's really problematic in a number of ways, because most of what companies are doing aren't things they talk about, and most of what they do talk about aren't that significant. So the most significant things they're doing, they're not talking about. The things they're talking about, this is, recycled packaging, or they're kind of minor things. So a lot of most of what companies are doing, the things I've been talking about, are not part of the value proposition of what they sell. Right? So General Motors has 150 factories, and probably 120 of them have achieved zero waste to landfill. And that's impressive. And I think company-wide, they're in the 90s, low 90s% of waste diversion. That's an incredible thing. And by the way, they're saving hundreds of millions of dollars a year doing that. And it's a significant environmental achievement, but it has nothing to do with selling Chevys. And most of what companies are doing is about doing less bad, right? This has 20% fewer toxics than the version before that, right? That's a beautiful thing, but it still means we're beating our wife 80% of the time, or it's not a happy story to tell. And so that's the disconnect. Plus, most consumers don't really want to change much. They say they do. They like the noun, but they hate the verb change. So it's like they're not very, so that's been a big problem. So getting people to do things different. We have all become greener consumers in spite of ourselves, because the products have fewer toxics or fewer materials or less packaging, or are made in zero waste, zero water, net new water, or we work in factories, or we work in zero net energy buildings, or we work with energy that's significantly more decarbonized than it was a number of years ago. But it's not because we've gone out. Now, with cars, depending on gas prices, and in things that there's a line between things that you put in or on your body and everything else, because those are more about health, personal health, and planetary health. So I don't have a lot of faith in consumers. I wish they did. I mean, I know, my household, myself, and my friends, and the 25 people I work with, and they're earnest and committed as the day is long. But nobody does everything that you should do. Not eating meat, or eating less meat, or making sure that everything you buy comes from a responsible source, or isn't, from a problematic place. So that's a challenge, and I haven't found a way yet to address that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm sorry that was a long answer to a short question, but you had a question.
Yeah, so actually you just touched a bit on it when you were mentioning the aspect of the meat. So there are a few companies, either the ones that sell food or don't sell food, they're taking steps to move away from animal-based products and more towards plant-based products, or some big meat companies buying those plant-based companies. But what is there that can be done to get these companies to be a lot more aware of this, take more steps, and make it official that they're making changes away?
I'm sorry, to make the companies more aware of what?
Like the impact of the animal-based agriculture on the planet.
But you were talking about, for a minute, you were talking about companies that are doing alternative, like the...
Right, so I mean, there's bigger companies, and I forgot exactly which ones right now, that sell meat products, but that have been buying the plant-based.
Yeah, the
companies.
Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat and...
Yeah, but I mean, those are still independent, but then there's some like Light Life and Field Roast that have been bought by bigger companies. I can't recall exactly which ones right now.
So what's the question? I'm not sure
Yeah, so how can we get more companies to be doing similar things, to recognize our meat production is not sustainable, so let's invest more in plant-based?
So how do we get more companies to look at the animal food chain in particular to make it less impactful? I mean, so there's two parts to that. I mean, one is, how do you come up with alternatives? And there's a lot, and it's not just the startups like Impossible Foods or Memphis Meats or Beyond Meat and a bunch of others that are doing this, or a company called Just Foods, which used to be Hampton Creek, which makes the mayo, and there's a bunch of those, and we in that report that I put up, the State of Green Business report, we name 10 trends every year, and this year we named one of them is synthetic biology, which is where that stuff originates, which is biology plus engineering, basically. And I think that's a really promising area. And so we'll see more of that, and those companies will eventually be owned by PepsiCo or Cargill or Procter & Gamble. And I mean, in the next 2 years, probably some of those acquisitions will start. So they will scale. But then the other part is, how do you, if you accept for the moment the inevitability that people will be eating meat for a while of animal-based protein, how do you reduce those impacts? And a lot of that is driven actually by consumer demand, that particularly for animal welfare. That has been, so you see now, when a company like McDonald's started switching over to cage-free eggs, the whole industry sort of went that way, and Walmart jumps on board, and everybody, it becomes the thing. McDonald's, which I've sort of been fascinated to watch, has a whole sustainable beef initiative that's been going on for about 3 or 4 years, where they have convened something, they've created something, bringing all the stakeholders together, the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and they are on a quest to create some version of sustainable beef. And they've already started doing that in small pilot in Canada, and their plan is to grow that. Are they doing that because of environmental concerns? In part, the fact is that they can't meet their growth demands. They can't grow the way they plan to and want to grow without making beef more sustainable. So is that a good thing? Is that bad? They're doing better at doing the old thing, maybe a lot better in terms of creating systems that are, first of all, kinder and gentler to the animals, but also produce far less climate change, greenhouse gases, or water pollution, or other things. There's an old question: if a cannibal eats with a fork, is that progress? And that kind of applies here. Is that, how do you judge what's good enough? And there's a lot going on in the world of meat production and meat alternatives. The question I think you're getting to is, how do we get people to just back off of having to eat meat at every meal, or just eat meat as much as we do? And that's a challenge that I don't particularly have an answer to, but that is ultimately what needs to happen. Is we just need to eat a lot less of it. It goes to portion size, it goes to culture, it goes to all kinds of things. And that's going to be a big challenge, and that's why companies like McDonald's and Cargill and others that are either sell directly or provide to restaurants and supermarkets meat are going through some significant transformations of how they produce it. So you will, and then you.
Thanks so much for the talk. I was a few minutes late, so if you mentioned this at the beginning, just tell me. I was wondering, given the grand strategy and all the work that you've done at this intersection, what your thoughts are on within companies having a specific CSR department or a specific sustainability team versus having it more integrated across the entire company.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
So the question is sustainability, should that be its own function or corporate social responsibility, or should it be embedded? Yes. So it should be both. To say that we actually, in our company, we have a membership group of sustainability executives from 80 big companies that we bring together several times a year to meet face-to-face to learn from one another. They, they know that, if there's sort of a saying in there that if you own something in a sustainability department, you're failing, right? It should be embedded throughout. However, a company needs to, somebody needs to hold the vision, hold the metrics, communicate to internally and externally. So there'll always be a role for a sustainability head coach, but it's not a. It started off as a function of here comes Bob, look busy, right? They're the sustainability or CSR person, and now they recognize that this needs to be embedded. I have a good friend, John Imes, who used to run. Head of sustainability at the largest privately held printer in the U.S. called Quad Graphics in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I spent a day with him years ago in touring and seeing all the very impressive things they were doing. And they had 9,200 people who worked for this very large printing company. And at the end of this thing, I said, John, this is really impressive. How many people do you have working on the environment at Quad Graphics? And without missing a beat, he said 9,200. Bingo. That's the goal. So, how do you make that happen? That's the challenge. That goes to culture, it goes to HR, it goes in training, it goes to a hierarchy and how change happens in an organization. It's a whole organizational development component, which every company is challenged with. But it's an important thing to do. But the question about centralization versus dispersion is one that I think is changing nicely within companies.
So I just want to say, first of all, the point that you ended on with the what's the story we get to tell if we get it right, I thought was an awesome way to frame it. Kind of adding an additional bonus, though, to the answer that we might get to give. In addition to the sustainability benefits from the environmental perspective, I'm curious it seems like the value proposition was companies can save money and do better if they incorporate sustainability into their business. But I'm curious if we can also focus a little bit on like social welfare and social equity alongside that problem. And while it's challenging to add a value proposition in there because maybe it isn't like a resource as wood might be, for example. But do you think that there's a way to tie in the same benefit for a business while looking at social equity at the same time?
Yeah, so should sustainability be limited to environmental, or should it include the whole range of social issues? No, obviously it should. Sustainability is not just environmental. And we're starting to see more and more companies that are understanding that, and they were looking at social inclusion or equity issues through their philanthropy department or community relations, and they're now making that part of the sustainability function. And a small but growing number of the sustainability executives that we know and work with are starting to take on some of those roles, and they're starting to see, and some of them are the ones, they're not being told from up high, they're the ones driving this. They say, you can't have a healthy environment in an unhealthy society, let alone a healthy business or a healthy community. And so what do? There's been this move now towards chief resilience officers in cities. Rockefeller Foundation a few years ago funded the CROs, chief resilience officers, in 100 cities and for 2 years, and now they're starting to hopefully be self-funded or funded by the cities. And if you look at what they're working on, and you talk to these resilience officers, some of them are doing sort of things like coordinating all the different emergency services, and so that when there's something happens, they're working together. Some of them are looking at the impact of climate change and flooding, and how do we mitigate that, our wastewater systems, and how do we create natural infrastructure that will absorb things so we don't have to build a lot of sewers and pipes. Where I live in Oakland, talk to the CRO, and what she's been working on, she said, I'm working on social inclusion. we're working on equity issues, working on how do you create a sense that we're not this rich city and this poor city and this gentrification issues and all the things that are going on in Oakland. It's an exciting time in Oakland and also a challenging one because Oakland's been coming back for about 45 or 50 years and finally is now at a great place where it's a bit construction and people are moving in, but now people are getting forced out. So that's a resilience, and which is really I don't know if it's a subset or a superset of sustainability, but they're certainly connected at the hip. Has to include the social part of that. And companies are recognizing that where they do business, the communities where they operate, the communities where they source their raw materials all over the world, that social issues, labor issues, treatment of women, the education of girls, a whole range of issues have to be part of this. And by the way, they also have climate benefits. If you look at the book that Paul Hawken recently added, a drawdown, where they list 80 solutions to climate change that actually draw down, not just mitigate or level off, draw down, that if you put, these got, 2 of them have to do with education of women and girls. In fact, if you put those 2 together, they become the #1 solution in terms of empowering and educating and having them be part of more inclusive part of the society. So this is an issue that is definitely still, unfortunately, cutting edge, but it's one where there's huge opportunity. You had a question?
Yeah, just briefly, even if we achieve a perfectly circular economy, if the world population continues to grow,
Yeah.
that won't exactly be a sustainable society. So what do we do about population growth?
Yes. I hate that question because I don't have an answer about population control. I don't know. I mean, that is so incredibly complex, and it's obviously an issue. I think education is a huge part of that because educated communities have fewer children, but I don't. It's a moral, religious, ethical conundrum that I don't know. It's not part of my world, and I just don't know what to say about it. So I'm sorry, I don't have. I'm going to take one more because I think we're kind of at time. But yeah.
I put up a really interesting slide that had kind of a convergence of big data,
Yeah.
blockchain, a lot of things going on, and then they all kind of converge into one.
Yeah.
How far out were you projecting there when that convergence takes place, and what sort of companies are taking advantage of that convergence?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it wasn't about them all coming together in one place.
Yeah.
And if I did the longer version of that presentation, I'd show you, I'd take a couple of those in different pairs and what happens when, what those opportunities look like when you take blockchain and distributed energy or food systems and big data or something. And that's happening now. I mean, this event we do, Verge, is all about that. It's a lot of the big corporates, a lot of the startups, utilities, cities, and it's happening. I mean, if you look at what transportation is becoming, it's becoming this again, this autonomous, shared, connected electric system, and you marry that to transit systems and the precision timing that you can do with that, and anticipatory demand about what. How many vehicles to have at what time, and to really optimize systems like that, and the ability to move people through much. I mean, it's. I don't think there's a sector that I can name that is not. That could not be on that screen. So this is a revolution that we're in the middle of, that most people can't yet see. And this is part of why we created this event to show and for the convergence of technologies. You see a lot of, you'll see a lot around blockchain and health. Right, there's a bunch of startups here in the Valley around some parts of that. But I think putting it all together and realizing there's this toolkit that we have around that are both technologies and frameworks and challenges. We're there. This is happening, and some of these things are earlier stage. The electric vehicle revolution, let alone the autonomous vehicle revolution, is still nascent, but it's going to ramp really quickly. And I think we're going to see, you and I still have a few more years left, and I think we're going to see in our lifetimes a lot more change to come in how technology is going to just transform so many things. So I'm still excited. I'll happy to stick around a little bit more, but I know it's time for you to go. So thanks again.